We'll begin now. Good evening. Welcome to the University of Texas at Dallas. I am Rainer Schulte, the director of this Translation Center, and we are beginning to engage in something that we have never done before, and we hope that it will be somewhat attractive to you for the future. And after the presentations, we will have a question and answer period. It is my pleasure to begin to introduce the thought processes that have been haunted me for quite some time, and I hope that eventually they will be materialized and translated into our daily experience and practice with the students. The topic of this evening is not what it means, but how does it come to mean? It's a strange feeling to start with that. I have been thinking about this ever since I became involved in reading Steven Pinker's article, Academic Writing Stinks. And I couldn't understand what he was talking about. That came in 2014, and I was amazed that something like this could enter the academic world. You don't talk about academic writing could possibly stink. So from then on, there was another trigger, and I have never verified that, but that apparently a principal in one of the schools in the area here told his teachers that they could not teach poetry. I hope that's not true. I have never verified this, but that's something that should have never happened in the course of this world. So what we're trying to do today, my guiding principle is a German word, Vordenken. Vordenken, 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 means to think toward the future. There's no English word that would correspond to the original German word. It has become now a fashion word in the German newspapers, articles, etc., and also in books. Books are being written about Vordenken. So tonight we are beginning to think for. That means Vordenken. So my idea is that I would like to introduce the frame that we are working within, that I have begun to think about it, and hope that eventually it will have an impact on the rethinking of the interpretation of texts, of verbal, visual, and musical texts. And so the other part then would be to develop new horizons. We have started to develop a new poetic horizon with a different way of entering a poem, and we'll hear more about this tonight, that it becomes not describing the poem, but that it is there for bringing the student and me inside the poem, that we live inside the poem, we experience the poem, and we create the atmosphere of the poem. So this is the question, and what does it mean? Has to be abandoned for a while, but how does it come to mean? That is the change that I would like to talk about for just a few minutes. There's no such thing as the definitive meaning of a text. That's what I was told or taught when I was a student, that everything you did had to be reduced to a meaning. But there's no definitive meaning of a text, as there is no definitive translation of anything. Just think of the hundreds and hundreds of translations that we have of the Bible. So that's where we start to think. And now that we are at UTD in a particular position, because ATEC, the art and technology, and art and humanities have been reconnected. They were connected when I first came, because it was told me that this was going to be a new university in the future. And the innovation of that connection between ATEC and ANH is that we begin to look at the practice and the performance when we begin to interpret texts. The emphasis in the ATEC is obviously more on the performance, on the doing. And I think there is a connection now, and I won't talk about this tonight, but I just wanted to open my discussion in that direction. the interpretation of verbal, visual, and musical text has to take a corner, has to take a change, that we begin to experience the work and we're not describing the work. And part of my thinking comes from the translation, because translation is continuously to establish a dialogue. You have a word in another foreign language. What do you have to do? You have to find a corresponding word in the English language. And that certainly is not very easy if you think of all the mistranslations that we have, including the Bible. Yeah, there's only one possibility of reading the Bible at this point. So however you become religious, make sure that you read this so you won't be displaced in another universe. And I still don't know what prompted Steven Pinker to write that essay, but how it was. But I have for a while, when I had in my better mood, I collected a lot of scholarly articles. And then I presented those to the students and see whether the students would understand them, because I did not understand them. And there was once in the New York Times several years ago, a column, 3 columns. One was the verb, the adjective, and the noun. And when you put those together, you sound beautiful as a scholar. So I put those together for about 5 minutes and went to a seminar, a graduate seminar, and I began to talk like this. And when I was finished, I said, what did I say right now? And there was silence. Silence is always good, because that's the beginning of thinking. But therefore, I believe we need to reconsider that. And I have developed, and we will see that tonight, of how different entrances into the discussion, the interpretation, and the understanding of texts can be accomplished, and that the person lives inside the text, experiences the text, and not talks about the text. We have to get away from the overall question at all times, what does it mean? And once you have reduced a work to what does it mean, it loses its energy, it loses its atmosphere, and it loses its success as a living document. So we're going from there now, and my thinking then, as I said before, is anchored in the whole concept of translation. Translation now, it's making shortly its way into the academic world, which was not easy at all 30, 40, 50 years ago. If you were in translation, Margaret Sayer-Speeden, one of the greatest translators in the United States, she had to hide her work in the academic world, because if you showed your academic world as translator or translation, you would never be promoted. And that's a fact of reality. So having said that, we are interested now in the creative minds. And I have invited this evening two outstanding creative minds, one a poet, critic, and one a pianist. The pianist comes from the University of Michigan, where I also was and got my degree. So there's a kind of in connection that I didn't realize until we began to talk. So the first person who will be talking to us this evening to introduce some of this thinking will be John Biguenet. He's a colleague of mine. We have worked together for many years. He's a playwright. He's a critic and the former editor of the distinguished literary and cultural journal, New Orleans Review. We have published books together, and he is one of the most foremost thinking, forward thinker in this country. And I think this is his distinguished, what he has contributed to the education of his students. He is now a professor emeritus of Loyola University and lives in Texas, in Houston. He has, in his own writing and his own thinking, always been a Vordenker, which comes from Vordenken, the noun. Vordenker means to think toward the future. And we need this now more than ever in the career and in the situation of the academic world. Logan Skelton sitting to my right here, is a well-known pianist, composer, and distinguished professor of piano at the University of Michigan, where I also come from. He has received many honors for his teaching. He has very intriguing and innovative ways of how to get students to the recreation of the musical piece, which is not that easy, because a lot of musical pieces right now are being judged by the speed that they are being performed, not by the interpretive perspective. And so I won't go in there because there's a huge discussion now about the Van Cliburn competitions. He has given concerts in the United States, Europe, and Asia, and he has appeared on many national public radio and television stations, and he regularly performs at international festivals. As a composer, he is particularly interested in art songs, and he will be talking about this evening too, what that does to the revitalization, and has, by himself, has composed about 200 art songs. I had to read this twice in his biography, because 200 art songs to compose doesn't happen between lunch and siesta. So his teaching at the University of Michigan has brought him many, many honors, and it is a pleasure for me for the first time to meet with him. There's a sensitivity and creativity in his speaking and his mind that is needed these times to begin the Vordenken and begin to have a different way of approaching the verbal, visual, and musical text. Welcome to this evening. And I would like to also say that at the end, we will open it for questions and answers. So at this point, may I ask John Biguenet to come up. Thank you very much for being here this evening. I'm particularly interested that the younger generation begins to think in those directions. And we hope maybe we can change a few things in the academic world, which, as you know, is almost impossible. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I was a visiting poet in residence at UTD in 1980, when this is one of the 3 buildings that existed on campus. So it's a little bit of a homecoming for me. Rainer talks about forward thinking, but to think in a forward way sometimes means looking back at what we've lost and need to recover. The French poet Paul Valéry has an anecdote about another great French poet, Stéphane Mallarmé, and the post-impressionist painter Degas. Mallarmé hosted every Thursday afternoon a salon at his apartment, and Degas was a frequent visitor. Degas had an inflated sense of his own intelligence, and at one of the salons, he accosted Mallarmé and said, "I don't understand why you're so famous. You're an idiot. Imagine if someone like me were to write poems." And Degas actually goes off and writes actually some sonnets. I've read them, they're awful. And he realized it. And so he came back and threw the poems in Mallarmé's face and said, "Why are these poems so bad when my ideas are so great?" And Mallarmé said, "My friend, poems aren't made with ideas. They're made with words." That may be the most important thing that's been said about poetry in the last 200 years. The recognition that our medium is language itself. Valéry goes on, though, to say, but that's a kind of problem, because we swim in an ocean of words. So how do we distinguish those words which are to become poems from the everyday speech we use? He gives the example of saying, you ask for a match, I give you a match, and by giving that, the words are obliterated. They dissipate and disappear. But there's something about poetry that persists. What is it that makes it persist? Well, the English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins offered in a letter to a friend a definition that may be helpful in that regard. Poetry is language moving through a pattern. Okay? So at the very essence of the poem is a patterning. We sometimes forget that the mother of the 9 muses is Mnemosyne, memory. Memory is the mother of the 9 muses. And so not only in the aim of poetry to make immortal things that would otherwise disappear, but the very nature of the language that we use to set it apart from ordinary language so that it will persist, okay, is the requirement that we employ our memory in recognizing patterns and allowing the echo of those patterns to persist through the entire piece. And I'm sure Logan will be talking about something similar in talking about musical composition. The other aim of the poet, of course, is not simply to persist, but to move beyond mere understanding and give the reader not the understanding of our lives as human beings, but instead the experience. And since all experience comes to us, and finally all ideas, by swimming up the canals of our ears and along flashing the optic nerve, fingertips, the tongue, the nose, it is the five senses in which the world arrives and then manifests itself internally within us. And so Federico Garcia Lorca, the great Spanish poet, Rainer mentioned translation. Translators joke about Lorca. He's the only man who's ever been assassinated twice. First by Franco, and then by Ben Bellet, his English translator. In fact, I had a friend, an artist, who learned Spanish just so he could read Lorca, because he told me, Lorca can't possibly be this bad. If we keep in mind those things about poetry, we also have to ask, but why is all this necessary? Why is poetry essential? And for me, the simplest way of understanding that is to recognize that poetry is the last resort of language. Okay? I've written novels, short stories, plays, essays, all sorts of things. Poetry is always my last choice. Okay? Because if I know what something is called, I can tell a story about it, okay, or write an essay about it. But if something has happened to me that I have no name for, that falls between the words that we have, I'm stuck, okay, if I want to speak to it as a writer. And so, as I suggest here, when we can't name something, we make comparisons. I don't know what it's called, but it's sort of like this, and it's sort of like that, okay? Well, at that point, we're in the world of metaphor, of imagery, okay? And that's the way we cross the abyss of silence, of emptiness, where our language fails to announce some sound that will encapsulate what we recognize by that emotion, okay? And I want to give a very simple example here. The National Endowment for the Arts hired me as a traveling poet, basically, this is back in the 70s, to travel around Arkansas and go to classrooms, everything from kindergarten through 12th grade, talking with students about what poetry is and getting them to write poems. And in September, in one little school in Mountain View or some small town in Arkansas, a teacher took me aside and said, the boy in the second row, he was raised by his grandmother, and this summer he found her dead in the kitchen. He's been orphaned by it. So you might want to stay away from poems like that. And I said, well, thank you, and I did. Instead, I tried to get the students to write a metaphor, a simple comparison about something that they had experienced that was a strong sensation. Well, it turned out this young man, maybe 14 years old, 15 years old, wrote about discovering the death of his grandmother, finding her dead in the kitchen, in fact, and what it felt like. And at that age, of course, he's right between childhood and adulthood. And so childhood is the freshest sense of senses that are available to him. And this is what he said, that at that moment, my heart was the red balloon held too long beneath the summer faucet. My heart was the red balloon held too long beneath the summer faucet. Mm-hmm. You can see the points of comparison, of course, that the red balloon is like the red heart, okay? But it's a special kind of balloon here, isn't it? Held too long beneath the summer faucet. What kind of balloon is he talking about? A water balloon, right? And particularly in the summer, of course, where you would play with water balloons, the water from the faucet would be warm, certainly in the South, in Arkansas. And so if we were to hold one of those water balloons that can only swell so much because otherwise they'll burst, right, about the size of a human heart, and as warm as the heart's blood in its palm, but just about too long, too overfilled, what's going to happen? It's going to burst. But of course, I was a 14-year-old boy, and I never would have admitted to my classmates I was about to cry, or that I had cried. And so he found this subterfuge, this way of talking about his heart breaking, his heart bursting. But he didn't reduce it to that cliche. By using the senses, the poet is the professor of the five senses, right? Both committed to the five senses and teaching us something about the five senses in the process. He found the way of expressing the particular grief that he felt that summer afternoon when he walked into the kitchen and saw his grandmother's body. That's what poetry can do. It can name that particular grief that in English or in any other language we don't have the name of, but it can communicate it to us. That happened, as I said, in the 70s, 50 years ago. Think how many words I've heard, I've spoken in the last 50 years, in half a century. How many have disappeared like breath, okay? Somehow or other, these words have clung together for 50 years, right? That's poetry. That is the persistence of the expression of human experience in words when they're organized properly through patterns to express to our senses what we have experienced, okay? But there's more to it. That's William Carlos Williams, a doctor in New Jersey, a pediatrician and a general practitioner. I was told once that he delivered over 1,000 babies in his career, but also a great American poet. And he wrote one of the simplest poems in the canon of American literature in 1934. And now, 90 years later, it still exists for us. Right? And it's a poem that once you hear, you hardly need to look at it. You can remember it. It's so simple. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Right? What do you think that poem is saying? What's its meaning? Right. My wife is here, so you'll forgive me if I slip into husband and wife on this one. But it sounds to me like something that's happened in our marriage over the last 50 years. That, I came in late one night, probably from a poetry reading or something, and there was something really good in the refrigerator, and I ate it. Right? Now, of course, I know women are guilty of the same kind of selfishness, but it just seems, from my experience, to lodge itself in a male voice. And you, a partner, maybe a spouse, has put away something for breakfast, and it's been devoured. Why should, let's say he and she, just to be simple about it, forgive me? Well, because they gave you so much pleasure. Right? What a bad little boy husbands can be. Right? And it's really that simple, isn't it? This is just to say, as he points out, I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. You know damn well, it's not probably, he knows. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold, okay? But when we look at that, having figured out, well, that's what it says, that doesn't explain why it's lasted 90 years. And this is a poem, I assure you, 100 years from now will still be read. Not just read, but memorized, right? How have those words clung together? Okay? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to the title of the session this evening, not what does it mean, but how does it come to mean? The poet has a lot of decisions to make. Okay? One of them is this simple distinction that every poet makes every time she or he begins to write. Is the poem going to be stichic? And these are mostly Greek terms, but they're very straightforward. Literally, does it stick together, or there's no break between it? Or is it strophic, where it's not regularized, but it's kind of broken into thought portions, maybe? Or it can be stanzaic, which is form of the strophic, where every grouping, every strophe has the same number of lines and has other kinds of regularities that they share. Well, if you ask yourself, what difference does it make? I'll give you an example. I've got a poem about, that begins, the title is, They Told Me You Were Dead. And it's the immediate reaction to that news about someone that the speaker loves who has died. The poem couldn't possibly be stanzaic, could it? I mean, that immediate punch in the heart when someone you love has died and you just found out. How can you take the time to organize it into neat little stanzas that are exactly symmetrical? I mean, wouldn't that betray the emotion? Wouldn't it seem inauthentic? Okay. Now, the strophic, maybe 2 days later, you start to organize your feelings, but it's not as symmetrical as the stanzaic. By the time you get to the stanzaic, you seem to have fully digested that emotion, no matter how powerful it is, and have organized a very carefully constructed little poem. Remember, the title is This Is Just to Say, but if you remember the poem, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, stanza 1, and which you were probably saving for breakfast, stanza 2. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Okay? So already we see one more contradicting its title, This Is Just to Say. There's a pattern here. And if we look even more closely, there are variations among those patterns as well. It's certainly stanzaic in 4 lines. Okay? And one of the demands of the stanza, when you write in a stanzaic form, is that the stanzas are equatable to elements of your argument. So if you got a 3-stanza poem, at least in short poems this is true, there should be 3 parts to your argument, okay? Like a dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that sort of thing. Notice that what we have here are lines that are either 3 words long or 2 words long, except for 1 line, saving 1 word. Okay? One of the other things that becomes apparent is that the initial stanza has 3 words, 2 words, 3 words, 2 words, but look at the last stanza. It's inverted. 2 words, 3 words, 2 words, 3 words. Right? So there's kind of inverted symmetry that exists in this little poem, right? Which somehow means we've gone from the beginning and by the end, it's all turned around. Something else has happened there. Right? If, as I suggested, a stanzaic poem should have as many stanzas as there are parts to the element, you can see what the first stanza is about. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox. The second stanza, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. And then look at the third one. You understood, since this is an imperative, you forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Okay? So first stanza, I, second stanza, you, third stanza, the 2 of us. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. All right? So this is not just a mere, I got 12 lines, so I'll break them into 3 stanzas. There is a reason why they're broken into 3 stanzas. And we can go further. Williams told an interviewer named Gerber in 1950 that the interviewer said, how can you even call that a poem? Okay? He said, it's absolutely metrical, right? Which doesn't seem to be the case. It can't be as regular as blank verse. You know? I turned around to see if I had died. Okay? Iambic pentameter. But in fact, if you look at how it would sound, if you forget about the line breaks, it's 10 anapaests and 2 iambs. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were and there it breaks. Probably saving for breakfast, forgive me, they, it breaks again. Were delicious, so sweet and so cold. This is a highly metrical poem. As always, the pattern is not where the meaning is found, but it's in the violation of the pattern, the variation, where the real meaning is. And look at the 2 places where this breaks, in which you were probably, he knows that's exactly what was going on. They were there for her breakfast. So his very clever little, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you, and as soon as he gets to you, he can't maintain that anymore. And then once again, forgive me, they. And now why should you forgive me? Again, the rhythm breaks down. Okay? This is just to say. There are very few poems in anapaests. Lord Byron has a poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, that begins, the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, about a cavalry charging down a hillside faster and faster. So you can see why it's a difficult medium to use. He's done it. 10 anapaests, 2 iambs in this. All right? So if we go just a little further, suddenly we realize this is an incredibly compressed poetic composition. Okay? Even the title, This Is Just to Say, it's not like Ode on a Grecian Urn, and then the poem starts. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums. So he's not wasting the title because he's got so little to work with. He's turning this little tiny thing into a poem that's already lasted nearly 100 years. What season is it? What do you think? I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox? Obviously summer, right? And which you were saving for breakfast? What time is it? It's night. Now, remembering William Carlos Williams delivered maybe 1,000 babies, you can imagine him coming home late at night, having gone through the anxiety of birthing a child, and then suddenly he sees these plums waiting for him, for her, for both of them. Okay? What room is it in? It's got to be the kitchen, right? And that explains something else. Why is it such a narrow poem? Why is it either 2 words long, 3 words long, or in one case, 1 word? What kind of paper do you find in a kitchen? 2 types. A grocery receipt or a grocery list. And I don't know why grocery lists are so long and small, but they're the right size to write a poem like this on the back of. All right? So when he says this is just to say, even the shape of the poem is trying to convince you, yeah, this is just a little nothing. Don't worry about it. I ate the plums. Forget it. All right? To whom is it addressed? There's that you. But it's a you who's very special. It's a you who postpones pleasure, who can save things and then savor them later. All right? Where was the poem left, do you think? This was in 1934, so we didn't have magnets on refrigerators yet. In fact, we had ice boxes. We didn't have refrigerators. So where would he have put the poem where she would find them the next morning? Where the plums had been? So she opens the door, and the plums have miraculously turned into an immortal poem. Yes? No? So what was exchanged? Okay. Plums, delicious. Again, speaking to the senses, we know what they taste like. We can feel the juice running down our chins, how cold they would be in the hand, right? Certainly an image that's full of sensuality, all right? And what was exchanged instead, as I hope you're beginning to agree, was an extraordinarily beautifully crafted poem, a poem that deserves to have lived for 100 years. So he gave her an immortal poem in return for plums, all right? Which leads us to the question, what then was the subject of this poem? Okay. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. All right. Is this a portrait of a person? Is it a love poem? But what kind of love is being expressed here? Okay. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox. Look at how plain spoken that is. And then it gets very much more complex, subordinate clause, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Notice saving is the only place where there's just 1 word. It jumps off the page because it's not part of the pattern, it's a variation. How important is saving in our culture? The savior that has religious context. But a person who saves is good. A person who throws money down the drain is bad. This is a person capable of saving, all right? And then something similar happens when the 2 of them come together. You forgive me? How important is the word forgive? What if he just said, my bad, right? Sorry, right? How big a deal is the word forgive? I apologize. That doesn't come up to forgive. Is forgive a very, very powerful word, okay? Forgive me. He's begging for forgiveness. And why? And this is where the portrait becomes complete. Because I enjoyed them so much. How does she love him? What would she prefer? His happiness to her own? His enjoyment to her pleasure? Right? Is she better than he is? At least in terms of loving another human being. And is he immortalizing the fact that this woman loved better than he was capable of? Right? Is this a great love poem? And you can see it's not in what was said, but it was how it was said. Why did it last 100 years? Because of the anapaests, because of the stanza form, because of all the choices he made, not to waste a single word to get to the point that that woman knows how to love more than I do. So it's both a confession of love, in a sense, and a portrait of a wonderful lover. Since I began with a portrait, a photograph of Dr. Williams, I thought I would end with a portrait of his muse. And I was able to find a picture of her in her kitchen. That was his wife, Flossie Williams. Okay. That's what asking yourself, why did a poet do something? Now let me ask one final question. Why doesn't the poem rhyme? If he can write a poem in Anapes, very tough assignment for a poet, he's certainly capable of rhyming. But what would have happened if the poem had rhymed? That this is just to say, okay, would immediately have been diluted. So instead, the one thing he can't show is rhyme. So he chooses every other kind of patterning so that this is just to say begins to be inverted and finally becomes something else entirely. Okay? That's how poetry means. Okay? And so if you're reading poetry, if you love poetry, always ask the question, why did she or he, the poet, do that? And why did she or he not do something else that could have been done? And when you get to that level, you begin to understand not what it means, but how it comes to mean. Now you're going to get some musical examples from my former student and my very good friend, Logan Skelton.
Great good fortune as a student, a music student, to take a class of John Biguenet when I was at a very formative part of my education. I was in my early 20s, and it changed my life forever. And what he just did, he did with me in a semester, a wonderful semester of studying poetry with a real poet. And I kept bringing poems that I liked and responded to, and John patiently went through them with me and kept pointing out things. And I have to confess that deep inside I felt, why is he doing that? What is the point of all of this stuff? And there was a moment in time that I will never forget when we were reading a poem of Wilfred Owen. It was Dulce et decorum est. And his assignment was to read that poem, and I had read it 100 times. And he started going through it and showed me how it was made and what it meant. And when it got to the end, and it's all about a soldier whose life has been cut short, and the poem itself was cut short in the last line. And he had me following the rhythm and the meter. And when it got to the end of that poem, and all the weight of the poem spilled onto the silence at the end, it's like my mind exploded. And I said I had no idea that a poem could mean so much. And he said, in a great poem, everything serves the meaning. And I said, I want to study music like that. And my rotten young person attitude about certain types of study evaporated. And I renewed my study of music, and I have never, ever stopped in all these years. And it was transformative. But I have the experience of finding artistic meaning, discovering it, sensing it, feeling it, living through it for real, that really changed my relationship to study. And so I thought I would show you, not in such great detail, but some things that I have discovered over time that are not apparent, not immediately apparent. And I will start, I guess the easiest way to think of poetry and the kind of influence of poetry on music would be when a piece of music is a kind of text setting, a song. And I don't have a singer here, and I You certainly don't want to hear me sing, but there are pieces that are piano pieces that are versions of songs. And one of the first is just a very simple thing, is by Liszt. He set 3 of Petrarch's sonnets, and the 104th sonnet is one of these pieces, these poems that he makes a piano piece out of it. And it starts by saying, I find no peace, and yet I don't want to make war. I fear, I hope, I burn, and I'm ice. It's all about opposites. And I started thinking, well, if I'm going to play this, I need to look at the song that Liszt wrote, and I loved it, and it was beautiful, and I could see where in the piano piece he starts giving a piano version of the song. And it was here, after a very agitated beginning. Now, in the score, there's really nothing other than a forte and saying, be expressive. And it goes on like that, and I just thought it was pretty. But I started thinking about the words, and I started writing the words into the score on the notes where they're sung. And I stupidly put the words in as a translation. And what you have here is, I do not find peace. But the original is, peace I do not find. Yet I don't want to make war. I don't want to fight. I had the harmonies all wrong. Peace was a beautiful major chord. I do not find was dissonant. And once I got that, I got the idea that what I really need to do is to play opposites, to sometimes give more, sometimes less. This is major and minor. So a major chord would sound like this, a minor chord would sound like this. That's both. Now I can do it again. Opposite. Now I've done that twice. So now I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do opposites in a different way. I'll keep that one up. The entire piece works like that very effectively. And I have to say, it's almost not written in the score at all to do that. But there are so many accounts of Liszt playing his pieces. And when he played, the expression of the piece was so tremendously powerful. That's the thing that struck people about his talent. He was an amazing pianist, but it was his expressive power that really came through. Another one is Debussy. He wrote so many preludes, and they're inspired by all sorts of things, architecture, paintings, concepts, ideas, dancers, little phrases from things. There's one that's from a line of Baudelaire, Les sons et les parfums tournent dans l'air du soir. My pronunciation, I'm sure, is terrible, but I never understood Debussy's music. I found it to be so fragmented, and I found it non-developmental. It bothered me. It would have one phrase after another that was just nicely put together. And then I read the poem, and I saw it was a pantoum where the lines would come back periodically intact. So you'll see things like this. That's sort of like a line of poetry. Here's another one. Etc. Here's another one. Why are these phrases just next to one another? What do they have to do with one another? And then periodically, he will bring back with very little change. And when I read the poem again and again and again, those lines went together and created a sense of time and space and place. And it was like jewels arranged on a page. And Debussy wasn't turning a jewel little by little by little by little into something else. He was arranging phrases, very much like the poem. And it helped me a lot. If you were interested in the combination of poetry and music, look at Brahms. That's another composer. The C major piano sonata, the slow movement, even though you don't sing it, he put the poem underneath every note of the slow movement. It's all there. You look at some of his early works, the Ballade, Opus 10, number 1, is an Edward Ballade. The notes that you have, he has a little few lines of a poem there. It's the same thing as the C major sonata. Those words go perfectly with the notes that he wrote. Another was the Opus 117, number 1, Intermezzo. Again, inspired by lines of poetry that perfectly go with the notes that he wrote. It's just not apparent. He just did that when he was young, but you could still do it when it's older. Okay. I have an idea that I've been thinking about a lot. And I really don't know what to think about this idea, but I observe it in music. And I was thinking that here I'm going to be speaking largely to people who are not necessarily musicians. There are some musicians in the audience, I know, and some people who have some knowledge of it, some people who have a lot, and some people who don't. So what can I do to talk about the way music works without using too much terminology? And the idea of tonal balance came to mind in a piece that you may know. You may know this piece. Whoops, no, I didn't include it. This. classical period music like this is Beethoven's Opus 27, number 2, piano sonata, the first movement. It's called the Moonlight Sonata, and it's very, very well known, and people know how it goes. And he writes it to be played with pedal down from beginning to end. But what's really happening? It's a chord progression that's sort of moving through different harmonies, different keys. But if you look closely at what he's doing, if you could imagine this is in a key, it's C sharp minor. He moves to another harmony, and another harmony, and another harmony. Some of the harmonies are below the original central tonality. Some of them are above. And if you could just bear with me, think of the key of the piece as being the center of a scale. And Beethoven might pile up some of the harmonies on this side. He will then move to right the scale by piling up some harmonies on this side. You can see that in piano sonatas. Sometimes the first theme of a piece will be in a key, and the second tonal area will be in the dominant, which is a fifth above the tonic. And toward the end of the sonata movement, very often a classical composer will move the harmonies to a fifth below. So there's a fifth above and a fifth below to balance each other. In his middle period, there are some sonatas. The Waldstein Sonata, this one. That's in C major. And the second tonal area is in E major. That's a chromatically altered third above the tonic. It's very unusual for Beethoven to do that. Instead of going to a fifth above, he goes a third above. And what does he do in the latter part of the piece when that theme comes back? He puts it a third below. Third above, third below. So I started thinking, classical period music seems to be so balanced. So this piece, that's C sharp. That's a seventh in the bass that moves to A major. That's a third below. That is a very special chord. It's called a Neapolitan. A Neapolitan chord is a half step above the tonic. So a second, the tiniest second above the central tonality. And then he's on the dominant back to the tonic. Okay, so we have the central tonality. We have a third below, a very small second above, and then a fifth above. If you could remember, third, second, fifth. Let's keep going. That's the dominant, fifth above. Now watch, fifth below. Now he's heading to a third above. It's exactly the inversion of what he just did. He's modulating again. Where is he going? I see. C major. Now, for those musicians in the audience who would know this, that's a very strange key to go to in C sharp minor. You almost never do that. What would you even call that? C major in the key of C sharp minor, but what's the other key he went to? He went to dominant, then a fifth above, fifth below, third above. He went a half step above the tonic. Now he's a half step below. It balances. And I could go through the entire piece like this, and I see, I don't know what to call it exactly, but I have played a fair amount of music that's of lesser quality. And I always, when I come back to Beethoven and really fine music, there's a sense that the modulations and the harmonic movement and changes of key belong together. They are right in some way. And I think there is something about this balance. And I don't know how much Beethoven at that time period would have thought of it as a kind of intervallic symmetry, but he must have had some sense of things getting out of balance. It's too consistent in his music, and for the musicians in the audience, think about it. Conundrums. Okay, I don't know what to call this either. This is a piece I played when I was a teenager. Now, that's Chopin's B-flat minor scherzo. They say B-flat minor scherzo because it starts in B-flat minor. Reasonable, but a lot of pieces start in keys that they don't wind up in. And if you go to the end of the piece, it's in D-flat major. If you go to the end of the A section, this is a scherzo. Scherzos are in ternary form, so 3 parts. The first part they call A, the middle contrasting section is B, the last section is A. So the A sections are the same basic music. And in a scherzo, the keys are supposed to be closely related. So it might be the dominant, the 5th above, it might be the subdominant, the 5th below, it might be the relative minor, which would be 6th above in minor, it might be something like that. But when he ends the A section, he's in D flat major. He's not in B flat minor. And then the B section is in A major. What the heck is that? Why A major? And how does that relate to B flat minor? That would be the leading tone major. That's not a thing. That's just not a thing. If it's related to D flat major, however, it's an inharmonic spelling of B double flat major. It's the chromatically altered 3rd below. That is a thing in the 19th century, chromatically altered thirds. But let's go back to the opening. People call it B flat minor because of this. What's this key? That's D flat major. Now F major. It's just modulating around and doing things. It's a little hard to figure out. But clearly, if you had to put a gun to my head and ask me what key it's in, it would be D flat major, not B flat minor. It is the D flat major scherzo. That's what it is, not B flat minor. But let's think for a second. We started in B flat minor. The next phrase was in D flat major. We had a bunch of crashing F major chords, and we had a middle section in A major. B flat, D, F, and A. And if you look at the theme, B flat, A, B flat, D, F, those are the keys of the piece. Those 4 notes. I have always thought that was a very strange, abstracted theme. What is that? It's just odd. But when I realized that those 4 notes are the keys of the piece, and if you go to the end, that's D flat major, B double flat or A, D flat, B double flat or A, D flat, B double flat or A, D flat, F major, and D flat, D flat, D flat, F with an F on top. It's over and over and over. I had played so many pieces during this period of time, and I went back to that. It was so right. I had this feeling in some of this repertoire, I couldn't keep it in my mind because the modulations were random. Why here, not here? And I went back to Chopin, and it was so right. And for me, when I start to relate the thematic material in a Chopin piece to the piece itself, the way it moves, I suddenly realized that I could remember pieces years later Years later, there were enough connections made that I could do that. And there are many more examples of this. I want to go to something else. Now, this is a relatively straightforward piece of music. I'm going to make a confession to you. I played many Bartók pieces in my life. I love Bartók's music. This is the end of one of his pieces that I played for years. And it's rather dissonant. And when I got here, I played it. I had no idea what I was playing. I was lying to the audience. I played the notes, but I might as well have been playing anything. It could have been anything as far as I was concerned. It meant nothing to me. And every time I got there, I died a little bit inside. And I realized that I can't keep doing this. I need to look at what's happening. So by this point, I had studied Bartók's music enough to know some of what he does. Well, I didn't put it as a slide here. I have it here. It's called octave displacement. Octave displacement is where you take notes that really would go together in a phrase very closely, and you separate them in register. So you know this tune. Here's Happy Birthday with octave displacement. Okay, you just change register. That's something Bartók does. It's something lots of composers that do. So those notes really are displaced in register. So I thought maybe I should put them in the same register to see how they relate to one another. Another thing Bartók does is symmetry. He was fascinated by symmetry. And these oddball little notes that lead to that, they're symmetrically moving toward these notes. So they move out by half step. Okay, he's approaching what seems to be harmonies. But those first couple of notes are just leading toward them. So I started thinking, okay, let me look at the notes that he's leading toward. What is that? And what is that? And what is that? And what is that? I had heard enough folk music. Sometimes folk music is it's in a key, but you'll tell me whether this is in major or minor. That's in major and minor, but it's in D. So this is a harmony that Bartók starts writing. It's a major minor chord. So it has D, F sharp A, D, F, A, those two. Now let me put it closer together. Okay, it's a D major minor chord. The next one is an E major minor chord. The next one is an A major minor chord. And this one is a D major minor chord. So now that I know D, A, D, E, A, D, let me put them in the same register. And you may hear something. That's a cadence. That's what's called a cadence. A cadence is a time-honored thing to do at the end of a phrase or a section, and it establishes the key. So in analysis, it would be 1, 2, 5, 1, 1, 2, 5, 1. And I realized to my horror that I had been accenting the wrong notes. So I'd been playing because I saw a group of 6 notes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but it's really 1, 2, 3, 1. And now I can hear it. I can hear the music. And when I looked at the previous phrase, this one, these notes lead to those in the same way as those. It's all very simple, but you have to work a little bit to find it. But once I hear it, I can't unhear it, if you know what I mean. New versions of old forms. It's one of my favorite things to discover. Bartók in particular had a vast knowledge, working knowledge of history and of great music. He was a wonderful pianist and a piano professor. And of course, he composed so much, but he was a great student of the history of music. And there's a form called rondo. But before I do that, I'm going to play you this very short piece. It's called Diminished Fifth. Now, that's not a compelling title. It's very abstract, and it sounds abstract. In fact, it's exactly the kind of piece that I would have detested when I was young. And it goes on like that. I was just bored out of my mind listening to this. I had to play that when I was young, and I just thought it was the worst thing ever. But when I was older, I started looking at it. And I started thinking, what is he actually doing here? This material, if you look at these 4 notes, these are the same 4 notes as those 4 notes. And these 4 notes are the same as those 4 notes. And if you put them together, it has a pattern. It's a whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. That's called an octatonic scale. Octatonic means 8-note scale. And he's given 4 notes to the left hand and 4 notes to the right hand. Most scales are 7-note scales, C major scales, D major scales, G minor scales. They're 7-note scales. This is an 8-note scale. It's just a very symmetrical, repetitive pattern. Now, these phrases, this same phrase, these 4 notes are those 4 notes. So what the right hand played, now the left hand plays. What the left hand plays, now the right hand plays. So instead of these 4 notes, he's switched it to these 4 notes. But he's divided the octatonic scale into 2 groups of 4 and then switched them, 2 groups of 4, but opposite. So it's still using the same scale. Now, an octatonic scale, because it's symmetrical, has a repeated pattern, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. It has a limited potential of being transposed. So a major scale, a minor scale can be transposed all throughout the scale. There are 12 different major and minor scales. Before you transpose them, you'll have to do it 12 versions of that scale before you'll repeat all the notes. An octatonic scale, because it's symmetrical, can only be transposed 3 times. That's it. Once you transpose it, sorry, whole half, whole half, whole half, whole half, yes. Whole half, whole half, whole half, whole half. So, yeah, there it is. So I get 3 of them before I repeat every single note in the scale. There's only 3 of them. And that's called a mode of limited transposition. And then I thought about what a rondo is. A rondo is, it means round. It keeps coming round. The main theme keeps coming round again. So let's call that A. And it will have a B theme, then an A theme, then a C theme, then an A theme, then a D theme, then an A theme, then a C, then an A, then a B, then an A. A keeps periodically coming back. And that principle, you don't have to always do it that way. You can have different contrasting material, but A keeps coming back. That's the rondo principle. The main theme keeps coming back. And that will be in the tonic key, the main key of the piece. And B and C and D, if there is one, will be in related keys, like the dominant or the subdominant or the relative minor, something like that. This theme right there is the A theme, and it's an octatonic scale. This is a contrasting theme. You see this P, that means soft. This MP means medium soft. This is the next transposition of the octatonic scale. And then this P, that goes back to this scale. And this MF, that's medium loud. This is the 3rd transposition of the octatonic scale. And back here, when it's P, that is the original scale. So what he's written here is an octatonic rondo. And instead of having related keys, he's taking the 3 versions of the octatonic scale. And then he gives the A theme its own dynamic, piano. The B theme, mezzo piano. The C theme, mezzo forte. And he returns periodically to that original scale, the original dynamic. See if you can hear it. I also think the character of the themes changes. Here's the B theme. Back to A. Here's C. Back to A. It's a beautiful example of what an octatonic scale is and what an octatonic scale can be and how it can be used. And I realized something about the microcosmos. I tried, much to the dismay of my young students, to give them pieces like this without knowing what I was doing, and they would always hate it. But until I realized what Bartók was doing was showing the materials of contemporary music composition and how it works. And I started showing people how it worked, and I had much more success, especially if I had a student who liked composition. I showed this to one of my students who was a 14-year-old boy who loved to compose, and he came back. He was improvising in the octatonic scale like a maniac. And I realized Bartók was doing something like that. Resonances behind notes. This is something that I just call it that, but there are some pieces of Brahms, late pieces that are so concentrated, there's so few notes to them, you hardly know what to do with them. They're worthy of contemplation. And I read some of what Brahms said about these pieces. In this case, let's see if Brahms wrote to Clara Schumann, whose opinion he respected greatly, "I'm tempted to copy out a small piano piece for you because I would like to know how you agree with it. It is seething with dissonances." And I think, I need to see this piece. It was the first piece in Brahms' Opus 119. It's an intermezzo in B minor. And I hear this. All these thirds, and I think, what is wrong with Brahms? That's not dissonant, it's just a bunch of thirds. Thirds are the way you make chords, major chords, minor chords. What's dissonant about that? I don't get it. What is he talking about? I read some more. There's another case where Brahms said, every measure should be played like a retard. Means to slow down. Every measure. I studied these little markings here. They're called hairpins, these little wedges. And there are a lot of people nowadays, me included, I was not raised like this, who are interpreting those hairpins as rubatos, espressivo markings. They're not dynamics necessarily. They're expressive markings. And my good friend William Horn, my old composition teacher, who was a professor of mine also at Loyola University, he told me when I mentioned that, he said there's a letter of Brahms to Clara. And these hairpins basically mean intense espressivo. There was an account of Brahms playing by Fanny Davies, a pianist who studied in Europe, and she wrote in diaries and in letters what it was like. And she said, wherever Brahms saw this, he would play it as if he could hardly tear himself away from its beauty. He would prefer to lengthen bars rather than make them up into metronomic passages. So with all of that intense espressivo, I told my former teacher and friend Bill Horn, he said, well, you know, Brahms wrote a letter to Clara. He was absolutely head over heels in love with her. And it said, my dearest Clara, and the letter is signed, your Johannes, and this is the letter. And it's intense feeling. He wrote 3 F's in the middle of it to intensify. But I started thinking, what am I doing? What is he hearing? Let me play it like every measure is a retard, and let me listen to the results. Now, it may be hard for you to hear. Followed by this. And this. And I realized something, when you play it just right, it's a little hard to hear. You hear a 9th chord, followed by another one, and another one. Listen to that. If I played that for you, and I said, who would write that? You would not say Brahms. You would say some 20th century person. And when you go farther, and you get over here, you don't get 9th chords. You get 11th chords. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 notes. So let's listen to this. And the last chord right there. That's a scale expressed as a series of stacked thirds. That's every note of the scale. Listen to this chord. And I went and looked at Brahms's melodies. And I realized they were stacked thirds. And that is something that started happening in the 20th century, was interval cycles. And Brahms was about this close to writing in that manner. And I told John Biguenet just the other day over dinner that he was alive when my grandparents were alive. Brahms almost made it to the 20th century. And his music, if you look at it carefully, was very contemporary. Patterns in meter, erasing bar lines. This is an interesting thing. John Knight, the conductor, went to the Toscanini Museum and said, I looked at his scores and he had erased the bar lines as if to say, forget the bar lines and think only of the musical lines. I was watching a documentary on Toscanini and he was saying that he did that, basically. He said, I wish people would stop pointing out bar lines. Bar lines would be these things. And it shows you where the downbeats are and how many beats there are in the measure and so forth. But if you look over here, you see that? Brahms is beaming over the bar line as if it's not even there. And I started thinking, what is he trying to do? And Toscanini said, just play the notes the way they naturally occur. With a bunch of bar lines, the music is in jail, is what he said. And I started thinking of how to play. And it's much more natural. 3, 1, 2. 3, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Plus 1. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Let me go down further. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It's so natural. There are more passages in here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. A downbeat and a meter is a feeling. And in the 20th century, composers started to write changes of meter. And it looks vastly different than what you see in music before. It's not that they suddenly started writing with an unheard of level of complexity. I think they started to feel that these bar lines were like graph paper, that people were writing music that this was showing you nothing. And the changes of meter show you what to feel. And so whenever I play Brahms, I erase the bar lines, I look at the notes, and I figure out the meter as best I can to go with the natural music. I'm going to go more quickly, and I'm going to wrap it up because I know we're getting short on time. It's possible to use all of this, all of these ways of thinking and experiencing and studying music in a comprehensive way. And I'll go rather quickly. this Schubert sonata, there are several things that I think you need to know in order to experience the music. One is a concept. Now, Rainer, I'm sure, will be familiar with this and could talk about it, and we can do it in the discussion afterwards. Sehnsucht. You find it in so much German poetry, romantic poetry. It's a kind of word that people struggle to say what it means. A longing, a kind of yearning, a craving for something, that it's often about an imperfect life, and you long for some kind of ideal version of life that doesn't really exist at all. But you feel it, you long for it. And that is in Schubert's songs. That's what made all the difference for me, is studying the poetry and listening to the songs. Another is this style that was very common back then called, I was taught it was Singverein style. I've also seen it called Liedertafel or part song. It's a kind of singing society that got together. People would get together, not musicians, but they would get together in something like pubs. And they would, your friends, your family, everybody would be there. Your neighbors, your cousins, your little siblings, your grandparents, everybody would be there, and they would sing. And they're not musicians. They would sing in a very simple way. And in musical terms, it's called diatonic, homophonic, homorhythmic. Diatonic means no chromatic notes. Homophonic means the melodies on top and the other voices are just supporting. And homorhythmic means they all move at the same time. It was very, very simple, and everybody knew it. Another is change of mode from major to minor, what it means. The first piece in Schubert's Winterreise is in minor. And if you know Winterreise at all, it's the most miserable story. It's the greatest song cycle ever written, as far as I can tell. Those are footsteps, and the main character is walking out of town. It happens to be winter, it's snowing, he's hungry, he's tired, it's freezing, he cries, the tears from his eyes freeze before they ever hit the ground. Dogs are barking at him. The love of his life has left him. He's going to an uncertain future. It's a disaster, and it's in minor. He says, as a stranger, I came here to this town. As a stranger, I'm leaving. May was here with many flowers. However, a girl I met, she spoke of love, the mother even of marriage. Now, crows are screaming at me, and it goes back and forth between major and minor like that. And when it shifts to major, it's a change of scene, a change of state of being. And at some point, there's a moment where he goes to really major. It transforms the opening, and now it's in major, not just major, but a Lydian inflected major, in my favorite mode. What's happening? He's walking out of town. He passes by the house of the woman he loves. She's in there, right there, sleeping. He doesn't want to disturb her. So he says, I won't disturb your dreams. I'll let you sleep. But so you'll know I was here. I'm going to write on the gate above, mein Liebchen, gute Nacht. I'm going to write, my love, good night, so that you'll know I was here and that I had thoughts of you. When you wake, you'll see it, that I had thoughts of you. I'll write on the gate, you'll see it, that I had thoughts of you, that I had thoughts of you. It's the same line, major and minor. What does it mean when it's in major? It means you're an angel put on earth for me, just for me. I love you with all my heart. And when it's in minor, it means you'll never see me again. And it expresses profound ambivalence over the same thing. And he ends the whole song down there. That's the male. That's the female, I think. There are so many examples of this. Schumann, it's a song called Wanderlied. And horns were in these Singverein publications in the back, along with the music, very simple music. They had horn calls. Horn calls were used in the countryside. There were different calls for different purposes, and people would bring, they called them Wald horns. They would bring them to these Singverein gatherings, and they would play different ones. But when you heard that, generally, you would hear them in the distance from the woods. You would hear horns being played. This is a text about a young man who's getting ready to leave home. He's about 18 years old, and he's saying goodbye to his family. And you hear horn calls. And what it is the world calling to him. He's saying, goodbye, my family. I'm leaving. We must part. Goodbye now, mountains, my home. I'm just going out into the world. And that's it. He can't wait. Now, he imagines, okay, what's it going to be like when I'm out there? I'm not going to know anybody. I'm not going to know anything. I'm going to be wandering in a strange place. I'm going to see a bird fly overhead. Maybe the bird was just 2 days ago in my own garden. I'll be so lonely. You hear this music. That's Singverein style. So what Schumann has done is when the boy is at home talking to his parents, he hears the music of horns calling him away. And when he imagines being away, he hears the music of home. He does the opposite. In Winterreise, you can't imagine how miserable these texts are, and these songs are heartbreaking. And yet, at one point near the end, you hear this. And you think, my God, he's found what he's looking for. That's Singverein style. You know what this text is about? Das Wirtshaus. It's a cemetery. He stumbles on his way into a cemetery and he thinks, that's home for me. That's where I belong. These are my people. It means he wants to die. How Schubert came up with that to express that text is miraculous. There's a long tradition in music to start in parallel mysterious octaves. Many pieces do that, orchestral pieces. This is in A minor. This is in D minor. Now remember the idea of tonal balance. It moved a fifth below. I really believe in a Schubert song, this texture would be depicting footsteps, walking, and above it is a singer. Singing a very sad and lonely song. D minor, D minor, D minor. If we go on farther, that dotted rhythm in a Schubert song cycle would probably be expressing some sort of military character, a soldier of some kind. And if we go farther, that's G minor. He's starting in A. He moves a fifth below, and then a fifth below that. He's going to the dark side of tonality. And if you go farther, there's a kind of war between the bright side. This is the dark side, G minor. This is E major. That's a fifth above. E major is a fifth above. They fight with each other. And then when you get here, right here, after all of this struggle, that's the Singverein style. And it's on the opposite side of the tonal spectrum, the bright side. And he mixes major and minor. I could go on and on and on, but I think I'm going to have to wind it up here, and I'm going to just skip Bach for another time. This is the way I felt. I seem to have been like a boy playing on the seashore whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. That's what I felt like when I finally started to see what music was and what poetry was and what art was. Jacob Riis, when nothing seems to help, I go and look at a stone cutter hammering away at his rock, perhaps 100 times without as much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it will split in two. And I know it was not that blow that did it, but all that had gone before. When you're working away at something and you're digging into it and you're not getting anywhere, remember, that is not wasted time. It's going to, if you persist and try, it will lead to something. Just something. Something worthwhile. And in that miraculous semester of study that I did of poetry with John Biguenet, I felt like I had eyes to see suddenly something that I had never seen before. I was aware of something I didn't know even existed. I felt like I had been looking at a hand that was pointing at something and staring at the hand. And suddenly I could see what the hand was pointing at. In music, I could hear what the composer was trying to do rather than staring at the notes in front of my face. But I sometimes got it by staring at those notes. And John showed me how to interact with the text, that it's a living, breathing thing, that you seek meaning, you seek connections, and you ask, Why is it there? Why did the composer do that? What is the purpose of it? How does it work? And it will lead you to insights. I felt that I had woken up, and that when I had done that enough with a piece of music, I felt like I was speaking the piece rather than reciting the piece, a memorized set of notes in proportions. I was saying them for myself. John set me going on a path I've traveled ever since. He said an image that I will never forget. He said, "You were reading like this, and looking at the structure and the way poems work is reading like this. Poetic devices, form, meter, everything. Real reading is reading like that." I never forgot that, and I apply it to this day in music. It shaped me, my work in the field, my teaching, my career. Any of my students can tell you I try to do this. And I want to end by saying John introduced me to a poem of Rilke, The Archaic Torso of Apollo. And the last line of it says, "You must change your life." And I did. And John and the study and the endeavor of seeking meaning is what did it. And I became something different. Yes, I'm just gonna maybe shut this down. Well, let's see.
I got you.
Let's see.
There we go. Why don't you sit in the middle? Yeah. I'll let you sit by the piano.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Logan, John.
Pleasure.
Getting an insight into the workings of how a poem comes to live, how we come to live sometimes, even though most of the time we're dead. So if there are any questions, we are open for questions and see whether there are any answers to be had. Please.
Yeah.
And so, it sounded to me like there was Greek.
Perhaps, I don't really know. I do know that the microcosmos was a huge endeavor of Bartók, and he talked about what the title meant. I don't know why he chose the Greek form of the word, but he said you can think of it as small scale world, a kind of microscopic world, and they tend to be small pieces. Or you can think of it as the world of children. They start with children's kind of level pieces. There are 153 pieces in 6 volumes. And then he was asked to talk about each one of the pieces with what they determined to be was a typical American piano teacher. There is no such thing, but they found one. Her name was Anne Chenet. And Boozy and Hawks got him to talk through every single piece in the microcosmos with her. And you can read what he had to say.
So the Greeks had a tetrachord,
Yes. Yeah, it may be in that particular piece. There are a lot of pieces in there that don't have such obvious tetrachords. Yeah. That came from the octatonic scale. Yeah. Holmes?
Well, for children that young, Kenneth Koch, a poet, wrote 2 books, Wishes, Lies, and Dreams, which was kind of exercises to encourage children to write poems. And then a book, a follow-up really for them, called Rose, Where Did You Get That Red? And it was children's responses to great poems. And the book talks about how you can present a poem by Blake, for example, and then have the children write their own response to that. So I think those 2 books particularly, Wishes, Lies, and Dreams, and then Rose, Where Did You Get That Red? Now, I would say for those of you who are serious about poetry and want to pursue it, one book I'd highly recommend is by a writer named Paul Fussell, and it's called Poetic Meter and Poetic Form. Poetic Meter and Poetic Form. It's out of print, but I'm sure somewhere online you can find copies of it. And it's a very detailed analysis of stanza form and meter, thousands of examples. And I've taught it even to freshmen, undergraduate freshmen, and as long as we did 1 chapter a week, they were able to stay with it. But I think for a poet, in fact, there's a magazine called Countermeasures in the 70s, and where it talked about where do you submit your poems, it said, poems submitted to this journal should show a thorough understanding of Paul Fussell's Poetic Meter and Poetic Form. If you've never heard of that book, don't send any poems to us. By a poet named X.J. Kennedy edited that journal, Countermeasures. But it's a very valuable book if you're serious about reading poetry the way Logan has described reading music.
In the world of music, I'm not exactly sure. I just collected things over many years from all sorts of sources. I don't really know of a particular book or 2, but I would say you're in music school, take notes, keep your notes. And when something strikes you, really makes you stir inside, pay attention, because there's something there for you. I was telling John and Rainer both that when I was in doctoral school, one of the things I did, which was mysterious to me, I used to go to the New York Public Library. This is in the long past where there were things called books, and there was no internet, and there were recordings, LPs. I used to check out recordings of poets reading their own works. Oh, yeah. And I'd listen to them way too much. I shouldn't have done. I couldn't figure out why I was doing that until I started writing songs. And then I knew why I had studied poetry so much and why I had learned the music of reading, because it helped me so much. So if something strikes you, and it won't be the same for the person next to you or that person or this one, it's different for every person. There's something there for you. You just have to figure it out over time.
That's happened to me more than once. I met Allen Ginsberg a couple of times, and I just couldn't get his poetry. And then I heard him read. He was reading Kaddish. And all of a sudden, I understood his rhythm was not what I was seeing on the page. Yeah. And so when I began to read his poems with his voice in mind, suddenly his poetry opened to me. So I think there's a wonderful suggestion. Listen to poets reading their own poems. Caedmon used to be a record company, and there's a Caedmon treasury of poets reading their own work. They recorded lots and lots of poets. I'm sure it's available online somewhere. Really useful if you're interested in learning to hear the music of the poem.
But my question is there a poem that you would recommend that Garcia Lorca reads?
I've never found that. And he died relatively young. He was assassinated by Franco. And so I don't know that he was recorded, but it's possible. I once found a recording of James Joyce.
He had a radio show in Spain.
Oh, then it must be available.
That's why they went after him.
Oh, I've never. Yeah.
But you made a comment about a translator that didn't quite get it.
Yeah, his name, it's kind of unfair to him. His name was Ben Bellet, and he had sort of locked up the translation market on Garcia Lorca's poems. And it was hard to understand why the Spanish paid any attention to Garcia Lorca when you read Ben Bellet's translations. And so people used to joke, he's the only man ever assassinated twice, the second time by his translator.
One thing in the world of music that's maybe analogous is hearing composers play their own works.
Mm.
Pianists are, please forgive me, they're terrible because they will sit there and criticize their piano playing. And sometimes they were so busy composing, they didn't practice so much and they missed notes but listen to the way they play.
Yeah.
The way they deliver the notes, the phrasing, the timing. Also, pianists are terrible about audio quality. They're recorded long ago and the audio quality is pretty bad. Don't listen to that. Listen to the music. And composers are fascinating to hear.
Related to that, the worksheets of a lot of poets are available. And Logan was referring to Dulce et decorum est pro patria more, the poem by Wilfred Owen. All of his worksheets have been published. And it's amazing how bad the early ones are. He rhymes the arms of Krupp with a machine going whoop, whoop, whoop. But then 16 drafts later, he's written a poem that ends, if you could follow what Logan described, a person who's inhaled chlorine gas,
Yes.
And it seared his lungs so he can barely breathe. And he's flung in the back of a wagon. And he says, if you had walked behind him and hear him gasping for air, his face writhing like a devil sick of sin, he ends with this: my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. But in the beginning, it was arms of Krupp and whoop, whoop, whoop.
Yeah, I remember reading E.E. Cummings. E.E. Cummings is one of my favorite poets, and I've written a lot of music to his poetry, and Emily Dickinson and other. And even John, I made a set of songs to a set of John's texts. But Cummings said when he was young, he had a poem that began, "Oh, the little birdie, oh, with its little toe, toe, toe." It's just embarrassingly bad. But what John told me too, this was also very helpful. He said, look at the drafts. They improve it.
Yeah.
Each time. So if you ever have the urge to write notes, make a piece, write them, and then look at it and improve it.
Yeah.
Don't stop because it's not very good. There's something about it that made you want to write it in the first place. Just keep improving it.
Yes. I might want to repeat the question.
Yeah, is there a piece of music I wrote that when I went back to it, it surprised me either in the theory or the emotion? Oh, yes. Let me think. Well, I have some pieces of music. I don't know what I was doing or thinking when I wrote them exactly, but I didn't really understand harmonically what I was doing. But when I went back with the perspective of time and a little more years of study, I could understand more what I was doing with harmonically complex things. And then sometimes I'll find notes that really could have been better another way. And then sometimes there are very, very personal things that I find I see more what I was revealing when I wrote them.
Yeah, an American poet, Theodore Retke, who has a poem, Villanelle, Words for the Wind, in which he says, I learn by going where I have to go. And he could have said, I learn by speaking what I have to say. And I think when you're composing, whether it's music or poetry, you actually learn what it is you're talking about as you talk about it. And that's why this process of revision and looking at your drafts is the path you take to get to what you discover when you get there. Oh, that's what I'm talking about.
One of my, I am originally from Mississippi, and one of the Southern writers that I like is Flannery O'Connor. And the way she said it was, I know what I think when I see what I say.
That's yeah. I think the fundamental question is why. When you look at the drafts, you look at what's finished, you keep asking, why did the poet, why did the composer make that choice? And why did the poet not rhyme the poem, for example? And this is just to say. And as you find the answers to those questions, you get deeper and deeper into how it means and therefore what it means.
And sometimes you will change your relationship with music when you see things like that. Like for me, when I first heard Schubert and Brahms, I just didn't respond to it at all. I was used to Chopin and all these chromatic harmonies. Where are all the good harmonies in Schubert? And I just didn't know the language. It was the songs that made the difference. But what John is describing here would apply to almost any artistic study. You don't confront a work of art and then view it as something set in stone that is there and perfect and it's to be revered from a distance. You engage with it. You put your arms inside of it and root around and imagine it different ways, and you manipulate it and imagine doing this and that, and you can start to sense the mind of the creator at work. And I just noticed, I was always told when I was young, learn as many pieces as you can because when you get older, you won't be able to remember it. That was not my experience.
Yeah.
When I was young, I read so many pieces of music. I memorized them and played them, and a few months later, I couldn't do anything. I had no idea what I played. But once I engaged with the work deeply enough, and sometimes found what I considered to be keys that unlock the locks of how it works. It was like I could remember the whole thing for years and years and years. I remember John. He was telling me in his office about poetic language and functional language. He mentioned that earlier today. But I don't know if you remember what you said to me.
I remember what Paul Valéry said about that. But
Yes, well, you were telling me that it lasts, it endures, it stays, it rattles around in your brain for years. And you said, you motioned to the window and you said, I could say it's getting late, we should wrap this up, and I'll see you next week, or something like that. And I would say, okay. And then the language would evaporate the second.
The second you stood up.
It was stood up, yeah, it would be gone. He said, or I could say, look at the purple jaws of the sky. And that was more than 40 years ago. Now, what am I supposed to do with that? Yeah. I remember it, I don't even try.
That's exactly how the anecdote that Paul Valéry tells about Mallarmé ends. He said, you can get rid of ordinary speech without any problem, you just act upon it. He said, with poetry, there's no way to rid yourself of it.
Yes.
Now, there's a line by Yeats at the end of his poem, Byzantium, that dolphin torn, that gong tormented sea.
Yes.
What do you do to get rid of those words? Since I read that poem, they've been part of me. I cannot make myself forget them. That's poetry.
Mm-hmm.
All three of you are creators. How do you know when something is done? Or is it ever done?
Valéry has an answer to that too. He said, a poem is never finished, it's abandoned. And translators add, it's abandoned in despair.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you could go on forever. And
which painter was it that was arrested in the museum? They found someone defacing the painting in the Louvre or something, and it turned out to be him. There was some little thing he wanted to fix. You know? I'm a little like that, but I'm always going back to things and thinking, but my heart's in the right place. I don't know. But sometimes you just have a sense that there's nothing more I can do.
And sometimes it's like a long lecture in the evening after a hard day, and the audience starts to leave. And I think we've reached the end of the poem.
Okay. Anything else?
Are there any further questions?
When are you coming back?
There's an interview with Logan online, and if you just go to YouTube and type in Logan's name, the interview that you did, it is a lovely, an overly generous statement about poetry, but what he does with the music there is really quite extraordinary.
You know that there may be more. I talked with that guy for about 2 hours, and he picked those things.
Those things.
And I talk about my experience with John and how it changed me, and then I talk about Beethoven. And I have so many more examples I'd love to share with you, but another time.
The video is very persuasive, though, and I really encourage you to look at it. It's marvelous.
I was going to say, John, I did a set of, John wrote a wonderful one-person play called Broomstick, and I made a song cycle out of his 6 excerpts from Broomstick, and I was going to tell you something. I never told you what I did with it.
But before you do, I should tell you, it's a one-woman show, and she's a witch, and it's the Confessions of a Witch.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is in heroic couplets. It's all rhymed iambic pentameter, about 90 minutes long.
It's very poetic, and because it's iambic pentameter and couplets, it reads like poetry, really, the whole thing. But there's an interval in music that was very dissonant. That's called a tritone. It's made of 3 whole steps. And it was called years and years and years and years and years ago, the devil in music. And so the entire song cycle starts with it's all these tritones, these creepy tritones. But that chord I just went to those 3 keys.
It's perfect
B
for it,
flat, D flat, and F is the tonic, B flat minor. And then all the songs are either in B flat or E or D flat.
Yeah.
And what you hear in the first phrase and the second phrase moves to D flat major. That is the seed of the piece. And it made me think Bach's first fugue in the Well-Tempered Clavier. There's 24 pieces in the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. And the first fugues have a theme, and then they have these contrasting episodes. They're called episodes, contrasting. This one has no episodes. It's just subject after subject after subject, and people will call it a stretto fugue. It's just like an endless overlapping subjects. Why? Why is it there? I counted the number of subjects. There is exactly 24.
Yeah.
The Goldberg variations, 30 variations. Why? Why 30 variations? And there's the theme at the beginning and the theme at the end. I can't think of another variation set. That makes 32 pieces. The theme itself is 32 measures.
Yeah.
I think that kind of thinking influenced me, and the way all of the elements of a piece go together to make a whole. That's what I learned from the study of poetry.
I would say just a note about that play. I was trying to figure out, on stage you're really limited compared to what film can do, of course. And I thought if she's a witch, she's got to demonstrate a superpower. And I do all sorts of tricks to hide the rhyme. So one critic said, I was half an hour into the play before I realized it was rhyming. The reason for that, I thought the superpower of the witch is almost always embedded in her language. She knows chants, she knows spells. And if the audience goes home and suddenly looks up and, oh, no, she's just a crazy old lady. But wait a minute, was she speaking in rhyme for the last hour and a half?
Mm-hmm.
That was the one superpower I could perform on stage that would hit the audience on the way home. And that's why the whole poem, the whole play is in rhyme. On YouTube, there's some video previews of it from New Jersey Repertory. One of
It's
the places.
wonderful.
And it's very appropriate since last night was Halloween.
Okay.
All right, thank you
Thank you
very
all very
much.
much.
I hope that
this is
was
helpful.